Well, it's lovely to see everyone this afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon session where we're going to talk about our postgraduate education courses and have some wonderful guest speakers. So we might move to the next slide. So the University of the Sunshine Coast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land in which we live and work and study. And we genuinely pay our respects to our local Indigenous elders, past and present and emerging. And we recognise the strength, resilience and capacity of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we acknowledge that learning happens on these traditional lands. So welcome to our webinar. Just a few housekeeping things. The webinar will be recorded and the recording will be sent out to you. And we encourage you also to use the Q&A function, so you'll be able to see down the bottom of your screen a Q&A speech bubbles. So we encourage you to ask your questions there, and you have the opportunity to vote on other people's questions. So have a look and see if your question's been asked, and then you can make sure that your question is answered. So if you can use your Q&A rather than the chat, that would be great. So thank you. So my name's Ali Black and I'm the program coordinator for the Master of Education. So that might be one of the postgraduate education courses you might be interested in. But we also this afternoon have Dr. Margaret Marshman, and she is also the program coordinator of the Graduate Certificate of Education. And we also have a graduate certificate in Steiner education. So if you're interested in alternative education, that might be a program for you. And if you're thinking about a PhD, you might also be thinking about the Graduate Certificate of Education Research. And so all our postgrad education courses you can study online, with some of our courses also offered face-to-face. And Margaret's going to talk to you a little bit about the fees, which is what you're probably very interested in, is the affordability of this wonderful study. Margaret, you're muted.
Sorry, I'll start again. So there are Commonwealth supported places available from next year. So that means that the government will contribute to the costs of your degree, and the graduate certificate then will cost about $2,000 and the Master of Education will cost about $6,000. And there's also fee help available, so you don't need to pay for it up front, but you can add it to your HECS debt. And for teachers in rural and remote locations, the Department of Education has scholarships to support your study. So to enter the graduate certificate, you just need a 3-year degree, but to enter the Master of Education, you need either a 4-year teaching qualification or a relevant degree and teaching experience, or the 3-year bachelor degree and a graduate certificate. So next, please, Chris. And so within our graduate certificate, we have a number of areas of interest. So they're not full specialisations, but we've got our graduate certificates of education, research and Steiner education, as Ali said. But with the general graduate certificate, there's also that opportunity to improve your pedagogical practice, to look at health and well-being, educational leadership, or digital security.
And the Master of Education is a really wonderful opportunity for those of you who would like some support to research an area of interest or an issue of interest that really matters to you in your teaching. And so this is an opportunity for you to engage in practitioner research and to, with support, follow a particular area that you would like to research and little projects that you want to implement in your school setting to make a difference. So there are a range of specialisations in the Master of Education, and you might choose to focus on education research or education leadership, educational leadership, advanced education studies, health and wellbeing, or Steiner education. And so today in our webinar, there's an opportunity. You're going to get a first-hand taster from some of our leading academics from these areas. So Dr. Joanne Casey is an expert on educational leadership. Professor Marilyn Goose, she'll be talking about the benefits of upskilling out-of-field teachers. And Dr. Joe Scott is interested in health and wellbeing and has research around the health and wellbeing needs of young people. So they link very closely to our specialisation areas in the Master of Education. So we hope that you enjoy the masterclass, and there'll be plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So please remember to use the Q&A and ask any questions that you have, and we'll give time at the end, and our panelists and our guest speakers will also be able to help, and Margaret and I can also talk through any practical questions as well. And we've also got Naomi, who can support with admissions type questions and support you there. So welcome, and I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Dr. Joanne Casey, and she'll be talking about leadership in education. So welcome again.
Thank you, Ali. And I'm going to ask Chris to move on to that first slide. I'm really pleased to be here. First of all, I would like to say that I've just finished my PhD, so 12 months into it. And what I wanted to share with you today is how the postgraduate education at USC allowed me to engage in learning that I had never contemplated and was really energized by. So the thing that I've been in schools for quite some time, and I've had various roles. And the thing that I loved most was I loved staying close to schools and being in classrooms and working with teachers in doing that and with students. But at the same time, I really enjoyed finding out about how schools worked, so the way they were organised. So my pathway was possibly unconventional in following a leadership role, and it was not a pathway that would possibly, you could say was stepping in ways that most pathways go, I suppose, in leaders. But the thing that I loved most was that what I wanted to share with you today was how my experience at USC led me to further study. So if we could move on to the next slide. So the work that I'd been doing was supporting schools to actually implement pedagogical frameworks, as well as working with them implementing literacy. And the conversations that I was having with my colleagues was that they felt that they were not necessarily prepared to do the type of collaboration that was being required of them and to lead that work in their schools. And so even though apprenticing was really, really valuable and important, they felt that there were certain skill sets that they could not get within the context. And what I wanted to share with you is how a particular course at USC or UniSC allowed me to actually be the impetus for further research. So if you could go further, Chris, to the next slide. So I was doing a research course, and the interesting thing is that we think about schools and timetables, and if you can imagine Friday afternoons, having the last class on a Friday afternoon, not the most energizing place to have. Well, my course that I was doing was a research methods course, and it was at 4 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. And I must admit that the first time that I went, I was groaning and moaning and thinking about how I would ever finish the week, a working week, in doing a course that was going to require me lots of thinking. But the interesting thing was that the exact opposite happened. I ended up being energized and excited to be exploring research methods. And in part, there were three elements to that. First of all, the lecturer was not only enthusiastic and knowledgeable, but encouraged and was really collaborative in his approach. The other part were the group of people that I was with. They came from very diverse backgrounds. Not all were doing education as such from schools. But what we found out was that throughout that time, it was really exciting. And to the point where when we finished, we continued our collaboration and read a scholarly book together and formed a scholarly book club. And we ended up, thank you, Chris, I'll get you to forward to the next slide, presenting with key speakers with regards to some thinkers. So it stretched our thinking in ways that we could not imagine, and it connected us with people all over the world. And what was really fascinating for me was that some of the conversations that we had been having in our schools were similar conversations and challenges and ideas that were happening in schools further afield. So for me, what I loved most about being part of the USC family was connecting with amazing academics and also connecting with these wonderful groups of people. That's me. I think we can pass on to Marilyn. Please, Chris. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marilyn Goose. I'm Professor of Education in the School of Education and Tertiary Access at the University of the Sunshine Coast. Chris, could you go to the next slide, please? Because I'm calling all, not just all teachers, but a very special group of teachers, out-of-field teachers. And let's have a look on the next slide as to what that actually means. This is the most common definition of what is out-of-field teaching. So it typically occurs when teachers are assigned by school administrators to teach subjects that don't match their training or their education. And as you probably know, this is very widespread in Australia and many other countries. I've actually been supporting out-of-field teachers, mainly of mathematics, for around 20 years, both in professional development and research, and also even in initial teacher education, working with student teachers who might be preparing to teach some subjects, but expecting that they could be asked to teach subjects for which they're not qualified. So if you think about it from a practical point of view, in a secondary school, or when teachers are graduating to become secondary school teachers, typically in Australia, they're qualified to teach 2 subjects. So that gives schools some flexibility in assigning them to teach classes. But of course, it's still really difficult to get that perfect match between the subject qualifications of a large body of staff and the subjects in the curriculum that the school wants to offer across all of its different year levels. That is a puzzle that can never be solved. So there's always going to be some level of being asked to teach a subject that you might not be qualified to teach. So Chris, if we can have the next slide, please. How I want to structure this 10 minutes is through these 4 questions. So firstly, well, what's the problem with this? And why does it matter? And then on to, well, what solutions might there be? What can we do about this? And what difference do those solutions make? So the next slide will highlight, I'm going to talk about what's the problem. And on to the next slide. Thanks, Chris. Well, I get the first thing to think about, the first question to ask is, well, who is a qualified teacher? And to answer that question, we need look no further than the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers that were developed by AITSL some years ago now. So to be a qualified teacher, you need to have certain kinds of professional knowledge, engage in certain kinds of professional practice, and also some forms of professional engagement. So when it comes to working out, well, what is out-of-field teaching, it's very much in that knowledge domain. So a qualified teacher needs to know the content they're teaching and also how to teach it. All right, so what are the implications of that? Let's go to the next slide and find out. So for us as teacher educators working in a university, we have to design initial teacher education programs that meet that AITSL requirement and produce graduates who have that kind of knowledge. So this is what AITSL says we have to do. We have to include in our initial teacher education degree programs. We have to have this number of courses in content, this number of courses in the how to teach it in 2 teaching areas. Let's see what happens next, though, as we go to the next slide. So if you just click again, Chris, there are 3 pathways here. So what happens when we design those programs is that they're accredited by the external authority, the teacher registration authority in whatever state you're in. So here in Queensland, it's the Queensland College of Teachers. The next stage then is that when you graduate from an accredited program, you are then eligible for professional registration with, in our case, with the QCT. What that means is that your name is added to the register, but it doesn't record the subjects that you are qualified to teach when you were studying at university. And that's the case everywhere in Australia except in one state, and that's New South Wales. So that third part of the pathway you see there, the certification, which certifies teachers to teach specific subjects, that only happens in New South Wales, not anywhere else. So what that means is that here in Queensland, once you graduate and become registered as a teacher, there is no record of who is qualified to teach particular subjects. So if we go on to the next slide, I ask the next question, which is, well, why does that matter? And let's keep going. There are lots of ways of investigating that why does this matter question. One way is to ask, well, how often does it happen that teachers are asked to teach subjects that they may not have been properly prepared for? And because of what I've just told you on the previous slide about the lack of data, it's really hard to answer that question because mostly we don't have reliable data. So what I've shown here in the table is some recent indications. This is from the AITSL Teacher Workforce Survey in 2021. There have also been several other very well-known surveys to try and get a handle on the numbers, but this gives you a reasonable sort of indication. So here are the 4 subjects which I would describe as being probably the core subjects in the junior secondary curriculum. And you can see what a difficult sort of dilemma schools have in trying to match teachers to subjects, let alone find enough qualified teachers. What I've also put on this slide is something that's really important whenever anyone talks about out-of-field teachers, because this is not a homogeneous group, not by any means. And so the support needs and the motivations or even the desire for support by out-of-field teachers varies a lot. So there are all sorts of different reasons actually why teachers can be placed in out-of-field positions in their schools. It might be to fill a temporary hole in the timetable, or it could be if a teacher decides that they really want to become proficient at teaching a subject for which they were not formally prepared in their initial teacher education, and they want to become an expert. So that's two very different sorts of things. Experienced teachers can be asked to teach out of field, but it's actually more common for beginning teachers to be placed in this position. And we also know that out of field teaching is much more common in rural and regional schools. So there's a kind of, there's an equity problem there as well. It may be that out of field teachers only have one class in a subject that is not in their main teaching areas, or it could be much more. So it's a very diverse group, and we need to keep that in mind. So Chris, let's have the next slide then. So, another way of exploring this issue of why does it matter is to think about what might be the implications for teachers and for students. And this is where we can turn to some research that's being done in Australia and also overseas. And again, I'm very conscious here that research findings certainly don't apply to every single teacher who's teaching out of field or to every single student who's being taught by an out of field teacher, but they are certainly things that we need to think about. So research has found, for instance, that for some teachers who are teaching out of field, this experience can lead to a loss of confidence, feelings of stress, feelings of inadequacy, because every teacher wants to feel like you're on top of things. And I guess the ultimate really terrible thing is attrition, leaving the teaching profession altogether. There's also some research to show implications for students in terms of greater disengagement, lower levels of participation, and lower levels of achievement. So let's turn to something more positive. Let's go to the next slide and ask, well, if that's a problem, then what solutions are there? And we'll just sit on this slide for a moment, if you would, Chris. Sorry, if you just go back to that one. Typically, education authorities will take, well, there's three possible strategies that they'll typically try. One is recruitment. Let's attract more people into the teaching profession, or as an initial career or in changing careers. And that's an admirable strategy to have, but it's also a very long-term strategy, because it takes, firstly, it takes a long time to make a teacher, and it takes a long time to address some of the embedded cultural and societal reasons why people are choosing not to become teachers. So this is not going to produce quick results. A second strategy might be to improve workforce planning at the local, school or regional level by trying to get more equitable distribution of subject qualified teachers across schools and across year levels. Again, that is not an easy thing to do. A third strategy, though, which is something which I know because I've done it, can be implemented immediately, is to offer good quality professional learning to teachers who are already teaching out of field, who are already standing in front of classes, doing a great job, but thinking, I think there is more that I need to know here to try and do a better job. So for people who might already be teaching out of field, or who anticipate perhaps an out of field teaching assignment, what can be done here is to offer professional learning courses that will upgrade professional knowledge, either of the content that you're teaching or of the how to teach it part. So let's go to the next slide and think about what might that look like. Well, I suppose one extreme is we could say, well, let's lift every out of field teacher's subject qualification up to the same level as a fully qualified subject specialist, like a new specialist graduate, in the way that's defined by program accreditation requirements. That would be a very, very demanding expectation of teachers, with all of those courses that pre-service teachers do. And I have actually implemented a program like that in Ireland, where I worked for a while. Very, very different cultural setting. And I really cannot imagine that in our context in Australia, that would be a feasible or attractive option for teachers. An alternative, which I think is much more attractive and much more feasible and very worthwhile, is to offer what I've called a partial upgrade. And it might just be doing one or two courses initially, just to give yourself a little taste of building some initial knowledge. And in general, it can be content knowledge or pedagogical content knowledge, the what you're teaching and the how to teach it. So now if we go on to the next slide, I can show you what does this mean at the University of the Sunshine Coast. So you would have seen earlier some of the areas of specialisation that Margaret referred to, this is about improving pedagogical practice. So here you see the list of subject areas where we are offering courses on how to teach these subjects at junior and senior secondary levels. So officially they focus more on the how to teach the subject than on the content itself. But I can tell you from experience, many, many years of experience, that whenever you work with teachers on the how to teach a subject, everyone learns more of the content itself. So you can't really learn the how to teach without learning more of the subject. So let's go on to my final question now. What difference does this make? If this is an investment in time and effort and energy that we are inviting you to make. So the final slide, I think, is next. There hasn't been a huge amount of research on this in Australia. So what I'm referring to here, this is the little summary of the research program that I was engaged in leading in Ireland, working with out-of-field teachers, just to show you what a difference it can make. So, and this is all published. So we had documented improvements in teachers' feelings of confidence, of self-efficacy, thinking that, yes, I can make a difference to students, and that sense of preparedness to teach the out-of-field subject. We documented changes in teachers' knowledge, in teacher beliefs about what is this subject about and what's the best way to teach it. Changes in their professional identity, their feeling of, yes, I am a real teacher of this subject. I belong within this discipline. We also asked teachers about changes they'd made to their classroom practice, and we documented changes in their perceptions of their classroom practice, and we also visited classrooms of teachers who had participated in these programs and observed changes with our own eyes. So I think there's one more slide right at the end now, Chris. So I hope that whets your appetite if either you or colleagues that you know or might be supervising would be able to benefit from these courses. So thank you, and I'll hand over now to Joe.
Thanks, Marilyn. And yeah, we might just jump on to the next slide, Chris. Yeah, so thanks everyone for attending, and really great to hear Joanne and Marilyn's presentations. And I guess probably off the back of those, I'm going to present today just to highlight the pivotal role that teachers are going to play in health and wellbeing of young people moving into the future. And some of this might be new knowledge to you, and some of it won't be. But I really wanted to just discuss the state of play. And I guess congratulations on being here and making the first step in potentially doing postgraduate study. And if some of this speaks to you, it might align to some of your interests in health and wellbeing, and it might also, spark some focus in your future studies. But if we could jump to the next slide, Chris. So what I want to take you through is what's actually going on with young people at the moment, and give you a bit more of an understanding of the role that teachers and schools are going to play into the future. And really where teachers are, like yourselves, at the coalface, and really in touch with a lot of this stuff. I want to focus a little bit more broadly on the issues, and then come back to some of the courses that were offered and some of the changes that have been made at USC off these socio-cultural issues that are happening. So I'm not sure if you were aware, but the COVID-19 pandemic was deemed the largest disruption to young people's education and development and history. And this is something that I'm constantly having discussions with people about. Well, COVID's finished now, and while there's still cases, young people, schools are open, everything's back on track. And really, what I wanted to highlight is the long-term impact that it's going to have on young people, and that it is having. So if we look at young people as a population group, we've seen that they've experienced parental job loss. They've seen economic changes to family environments. We've seen increases in cost of living and interest rates. And what the research is telling us is that young people are really worried about what's happening. They're really worried about the uncertain future, and they're worried about what's going to happen with their own mental health. And I'll show you some research on that too. So if you can just jump through some of these. So we've seen, if we look at physical and mental health of young people, we've seen decreases that have been sustained since 2019 in physical activity, increased sedentary time, so seated and sitting time. And that's also been associated with increased screen time and social media use. And what we've seen in that is that the increases in social media use and screen time have also been associated with reductions in mental health and increases in depression and anxiety. Research coming out of America is now showing that depression in young people is at an 80-year high. And we've seen changes in anxiety and things that have been the worst they've ever been in that population since sort of the mid-80s. So we are seeing some really significant changes for young people. And this is not something that has just gone away when COVID finished. So we're also, if we focus on what's actually happening here in Australia, you probably have seen the mission reports that come out. There's something that I'll look at every year to see what's happening with young people. They survey a large sample of young people every year. This 2021 data really showed off the back of COVID what they were worried about. And they really are concerned about the top three areas were their participation in activities, which had changed, their routines had changed. They're concerned about education and they're concerned about mental health. And that mental health has remained in the top three concerns for young people. But we did see really significant percentages, almost half of the participants that were really concerned about their own mental health. And what we're seeing globally is that the impacts are really disproportionate. So we're seeing that middle and low income countries are really having significant impacts. We've got, some of those stats I've just shown there really show, that we've now got some of those countries where 70% of 10-year-olds can't read. It's gone up 20% since the pandemic. We're seeing a sort of Swiss cheese impact where students they have got significant gaps in their learning, and then they've been pushed through into the next year, and they don't have the foundational knowledge for that next year, and that's really just impacting them and is going to impact them throughout their schooling. So this is, a real problem that UNICEF is worried about globally, but it is something that we should be concentrating on in Australia too. So if we could just jump to the next slide, Chris. So I just want to focus a little bit more about what's going on here. And really, it's no different in terms of what we're seeing globally, but we are seeing that the changes that happened in their normal routines are sometimes being sustained by young people. So I've seen changes in sleep patterns, nutritional intake, and we've seen disruptions in normal routines. We've seen some percentage of students and young people going back to physical activities like organised sports, and in some areas that's up to 80%, and others it's really low in some of the codes of competitive sport and things. So we are seeing a change in engagement in community activities for young people as well. And what you're probably seeing in the classroom is an increase in behavioural issues and mental health issues of young people. So if we could just move through a couple of those on this slide, and I'll just talk through some of these as well. So we now know it's going to be, a significant and long-term impact on young people. And what you probably don't know is a lot of the government documentation globally is positioning schools to redress a lot of the issues that young people are having. And really, for students to flourish as schools are well positioned, there is a consistent sort of message in a lot of these forums and reports that, schools are potentially the place for this health promotion. Arguably, what I've sort of said is, based on this research, is that, while schools are well placed, there really needs to be a focus on the health and well-being of young people before we look to prioritising and addressing some of those educational gaps. Because what we're seeing is schools shifting back to focusing specifically on getting academic targets back on track without worrying about young people's physical and mental health, or the teachers that are also in the school, which is part of the research that I'm doing. So if you could just jump to the next slide. So what I wanted to share with you was a recent publication that what we looked at was the Australian Human Rights Commission recommended that, schools need support, and so do teachers, and they're recommending this back in 2020 off the back and in the wake of COVID-19. But what we were seeing in the literature and in relation to our sort of anecdotal discussions with schools and organisations and across sectors, was there really was a lack of guidance for schools about how to actually modify their existing health promotion programs that they have in their schools to meet the increased needs of young people. And that's where we looked at completing a bit of a scoping review of the literature, because it was just increasing hugely off the back of COVID. So if we could just jump to the next slide, Chris. So we decided to use SEN's capabilities approach, which is a theoretical model that's been used for wellbeing for decades. And really what that theory looks to do is identify means of resources of people. We were focusing on young people and trying to examine what are their conversion factors. So how they, what are their individual factors and external factors that can assist them to be or lead to them having capabilities or lack of capabilities for wellbeing. And in that, SEN looks at sets of functions and choice and agency. And that then led us to assist us to design a model that was going to surround young people in terms of how can we support functioning across that classroom, school and community level. So if you could jump to the next slide, Chris. So we then had to look at, how do we inform this framework with what's going on in the literature? And really, we utilised that theory to look at some of the mechanisms across people, space and place. And then we looked at what are the existing things that are still going on for young people off the back of COVID-19. And we identified 4 sort of central themes within the literature that would enable young people to flourish into the future. And those 4 were schools serving as health promoters. We were looking at provision of support for school leaders and for teachers. And really what we wanted to focus on in this was how do we actually, what does that look like? And this model was, and the framework was one way to do that. But there was a series of provisions that we did come up and discuss in the paper. But there was a central theme that schools need to focus on social emotional learning, and that was quite consistent in the literature, that we wanted to know what schools were looking at doing and what strategies were being recommended. And that was sort of a consistent one that was coming through over that far and above of concentrating on academic achievement for children and adolescents. It was the focus on social emotional learning that would lead to academic achievement. And we also were, the other theme that came up was looking at school health programs and addressing multiple risk behaviours at once, and giving children and adolescents an understanding of the bidirectional relationship between physical activity and health. Physical and mental health. So that might be across a range of factors like physical activity, sleep, nutrition, and mental health more broadly, and looking at if one of those is not doing well, that potentially has an effect on some of the other categories. So, and that then led us to designing a framework, which is on the next slide, Chris. And so this is, sorry about the small text. I just wanted to share the framework, and I'm not going to read through this. This is free and open access. It's been published and it's available online, so you can download this. And really what we wanted from this paper was to generate a framework that schools can use. And I wanted to show you sort of in this presentation how research can potentially impact. You might be thinking about postgraduate study and you wanted to make a wider impact on your school, across your school, and that might be in health and wellbeing, or it might be that you're looking for a larger impact, outside your school. And this was probably an example of a recent impact that we've made as a result of this research. And really what this framework is to be used for is for school leaders and teachers to be able to utilise the framework to evaluate their existing health promotion programs and look at what they're doing across the classroom, school and community levels. And how are they associated with the outcomes of the individuals within that school community, including the school staff and their families, the children and their families. So if you could just jump to the next slide. So I just wanted to highlight that out of this paper, you might be interested in that sort of research impact, and sometimes that's something that we don't often hear about is, how does the research that we do impact what's happening in schools? And that is a priority for us that are working at the universities, that we are utilising research to affect practice. And I guess these were some of the articles that came out of this that was picked up by the media, and really the point of our team engaging with the media was to share this with as many schools as we could, so the schools were able to utilise this free resource and hopefully be able to evaluate their health promotion programs that they've got in their schools. Because what we knew is that schools are doing some great things, and other schools might be really in need of support. So if you just jump to that next slide, Chris. So I guess what I wanted to talk about next is really, okay, we've got a framework here, and this is based on research that we've done. So we know that if we put these things in place, these will probably work, but we know that schools are already short of time, they're short of resources, and how does this actually work? And probably what we did see from the research is there is a systemic need to support teachers, and part of that is increasing professional learning for teachers. And what we wanted to do at a base level from this is have a framework that schools can use to evaluate their existing programs and look what's working with our school, what's not. What are the problems that students are having in our schools? What are their existing means and resources? What's changed for our students in terms of coming off the back of COVID-19? What are the things that they're needing, specifically in terms of their physical and mental health and wellbeing needs? And then what can we do for our school? And it doesn't have to be that we do everything, but there might be areas of that framework that we can put in place or modify our existing things to reorient our service that we have. And I guess probably what some of the things that we highlighted in that paper were there is a need for a reorientation of health programs for schools. Many schools have had to pivot and change without much time, shifting to online and back onto campus, and then back on track. And I'm probably very much preaching to the choir here of many of you that are teachers in the classroom now, have seen an associated increase in workload. We're seeing people that are really struggling, and as Marilyn sort of mentioned, many people are teaching out of field. There's a range of other factors going on for teachers. So there is a need for support, and we probably will continue to see that. But probably to highlight that teachers are really pivotal, and you do play a really pivotal role in how young people will access physical and mental health resources as they move through their schooling. It's also notes that schools, it's not our role to solve all these social cultural issues for young people, and we can't do that. But strengthening parental and community connections with schools should really lead to young people being able to access better services, but it should also bolster some of those internal programs that we're doing within our school. And there is a need for policy reform and innovation within the school systems. So some of those outdated policies or programs potentially need to be modified to look at what are the capabilities of our young people, how do we utilise their existing means and transfer those into functions for them so that they can then flourish. And that was really that pathway that we were trying to focus on based on SEN's capabilities approach. So if you could just go to that next slide, Chris. So really, I guess, to finish off, what we've done at UniSC is you would have seen that there's specialisations in health and wellbeing. That might be a priority area for you, that you're interested in health and wellbeing already. It might be not your area, but it's something you're interested in looking at. You might be more interested in doing some subjects. We have a range of subjects that are offered in those grad cert and the Masters of Education that are aligned to health and wellbeing. So you might do some of those as some of those courses, or you might be looking at postgraduate study to help you upskill. in some of these areas so that you can help your current students flourish. Or you might be interested in specialising in health and wellbeing to advance your current career, or specialising in it in the postgraduate study. So they're all options, and there's also options of having, a health and wellbeing project within your grad cert or your Masters of Education that focuses on the health and wellbeing for young people. So I hope that gives you an idea of some of the things you could potentially do with your postgraduate research. And I'll just finish by, saying all the best with your potential study in the future.
Thank you, Joe. There are some questions in the chat. Joe, would you like to start answering them?
While Joe's reading the questions, there might be some of you who've joined the webinar who aren't teachers. So maybe you're educators in a different profession. We've had people do the Master of Education who are pharmacists or nurses or in another profession altogether. So the Masters of Education is for any educator. It doesn't have to be teachers in schools. So if that's you and you've been thinking, oh, they're just talking about schools and teaching, you might have a question that you'd like to put in the chat as well. So hopefully, Joe, that's given you a moment also to read through some of the questions. And please, we're moving into the Q&A. So please, we welcome your questions in the Q&A.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to answer. It looks like there's a question here about how we define responsibility of parents versus school teachers and schools when it comes to student mental health. And I guess probably what we're seeing in the literature and what it's telling us is that schools play a really important role in young people's health. And we know that they spend a large amount of their time there. And if we look at young people, if we look at the top 5 support networks for them within their top 5 people in their close network for young people, teachers are normally one in that top 5. We also see that transitioning times are the most paramount time for reductions in mental health. So that transition from the foundation years into lower primary, and the transition from high school to primary to high school, and also from high school out into the larger world. And they're also teachers and schools play a really paramount role in maintaining that transition. So is it their responsibility of the school to maintain mental health? No, but we do know that by putting in programs that support young people's mental health, it has a significant impact within the school settings. But a really good question. There's another question here around how do we do a better job of upskilling our workforce to deal with the mental health issues? And part of this presentation was around showing that there is an increased physical and mental health needs of young people, and it's probably not something that is new to you and news. You probably have heard that, or if you're not working directly with young people, you've probably seen that in the media. And really, I guess this presentation was around, one avenue that could help you would be upskilling through a postgraduate study. It might be, as Marilyn sort of was leading towards, doing some sort of partial study where you're selecting some courses that might align to more to those mental health. But really, I guess there is a range of things we can do within the school system without looking at upskilling teachers themselves. And I guess probably what this research was showing was schools that are attempting to reorient health services so that they're meeting the needs of young people now and trying to change their existing programs to help staff meet that need. So, ongoing support for staff, but from a system level, and also for teachers, that also has led to increased support of young people. So I hope that answers your question around that, but it is a complex one.
So there was a question in the chat about how did people choose their area of research? And the thing to do is to think about, what are you concerned about? What is the problem that you see in your practice? What is something that you want to know more about? Because within our programs, we're designed to help people follow their passion. It's not a one size fits all. It's an opportunity for people to explore what is of interest to them.
Can I add on, Meg, that having actually then started the study at USC, that then helped me refine what I was going to further research. So that for me was important. I started with my curiosity, but it was then refined and supported by the team at USC.
There's a question here about the Master of Education with a research specialisation, and that is a little bit different from the Master of Education by research, and it's different from different from pursuing a PhD. So our Master of Education is coursework, but through the first 4 courses that you do, and they're double courses, so they're the equivalent of 2 courses, it's an opportunity for you to do your own research project, but supported by the staff members that work with you. So you work through your own question or area of interest, do your own practitioner research in your classroom or teaching area. So if you're a nurse educator or some other sort of educator, then you will do a problem. You'll be looking at something in your practice, and then we help you get your research out there, as Joe was talking about. And so that is the Master of Education. But if you want to only do research, then you would either do the Master of Education by research or a PhD. But to do those, you need to have some research experience, either an honours degree in your undergraduate, or you can do the graduate certificate in education research, and that will then lead on to doing higher degree research.
Margaret, can I just add to the wise words
Yes.
that have been said so far about, you know, what kind of degree do you start with? Where do you find interesting problems? So I was just reflecting on my own rather long experience. I started with, after I'd started teaching, I knew I wanted to know more. I knew I needed to learn more. And I always knew that I would go back and do some more studies. So I did a coursework master's, similar to what Margaret has described, because I was interested in everything and I had no focus. So I found it really helpful to do some more coursework and just look around and find out, what am I interested in? And because I was qualified to teach mathematics and chemistry and junior science, those tended to be the areas I gravitated towards. And I was actually doing these as an external student in the days before there was any technology. And the first course that was offered was on research in mathematics education. And there was one in science education as well, which, you know, I was going to do later. I actually never got to do it because the research in maths education course, my lecturer gave me a whole lot of things to read. He said, just keep reading until you find something interesting. And I did, and that was the direction that my career went in. So I think having an opportunity to, you know, try out various things until you find something that really hits it for you, even though I know that for many of you, you already know what you care about, and that's probably when you can go straight for a research degree.
Thanks, Marilyn. And Joe, can you answer the other question in the chat?
So it looks
please?
like, sorry, I missed one. It looks like there was a question around the, is there a policy around certain standards that school needs to have regarding wellbeing of students? So it depends on the system that you're working in. So, and there is guidance provided by state and independent and Catholic schools around wellbeing, but it is something that principals have the autonomy to look at how they implement and put those policies into practice within their own schools. So what we often see is a gap between policy and practice, as you probably know. And really, I guess probably what I was highlighting today was, while there is existing policies out there, there is potentially a need to look at how we reorient those. And obviously the other thing that's probably you hear is this term well-being, and what does that actually mean? So when we hear about wellness and we think, okay, this is probably around physical health, and well-being potentially more around mental health. If you look up wellbeing policies for schools, you'll see a range of different health promotion areas that are covered within those policies. So it's looking at potentially what are the priorities and the needs of young people in our school, or whatever area that you're working in, and how do we sort of implement and take those recommendations of the policies and potentially modify those if they need innovation, and put those into practice within our school systems.
Thanks, Joe.
Well, we'd like to thank you all for coming, and we hope that you've enjoyed meeting some of our staff and learning about some of our research. We really look forward to having you at UniSC, and remember that we've got those Commonwealth supported places which make postgraduate study really affordable for you. So thank you again. We will send out recordings for you, the webinar recording and some contact details and the program links. So again, we'd like to thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you studying with us.